שלום לסטיבן ג'נקינסון ונועה ברקת. אנחנו מאוד מאוד שמחים לארח היום את סטיבן ג'נקינסון, מורה, אקטיביסט, משורר, מחבר הספר למות חכם. מורה שלימד רבים מאיתנו להסתכל מעבר לסיפורים התרבותיים על מוות וחיים, ולשאול את עצמנו מה המשמעות של להיות בני אנוש בעידן הזה ובזמן הזה. We're very, very happy to have you with us today, Stephen Jenkinson, an activist, a writer and a poet, and a teacher to many of us about what it means to be human in this day and age. Thank you so much for being with us. And Noah Bareket, the publisher and translator of the book, Die Wise, your book, into Hebrew. The first time, a real blessing to all of us, the first time this book has been translated into a language other than English, right?
No, there was Turkish first and now Hebrew.
Oh, wow. So a strong Middle Eastern, yes, a strong Middle Eastern representation. So you've often said before that this book needs to be translated from English to English, right?
From me to English, yes.
So maybe you can say something about that to us.
Sure. Well, if I were to employ the English language, as I understand it, sort of a Canadian-esque English language.
Yes.
As I understand it, in the normal way that it's employed, at the end of the conversation, things would be exactly the same as they are now. I mean, unfortunately, the English language is principally responsible for globalization. That's how it's happening. And globalization is carried on the back of ordinary, pedantic, prosaic English. And so between that concern and on the other side, you know, when I was working with dying people for so long, I found that the language that they were spoken to with and the language they themselves used was almost guaranteed that the death phobia that I've talked about so often would continue, usually unawares, because the death phobia is carried in the language. You see, it's buried in the language and it's there all the time. And so whenever people were trying to reassure or restore the good feelings of dying people, they would usually lie to them. That's how they did it. I don't mean factual lies, really. I mean poetic lies, which are worse by far, because poetic lies take a language that seems self-evident and find some way to unsay it. So in the English that was used in the death trade, you never saw the realities of dying appear. People would seem to be talking about dying, but they did so in such a way to make sure that the realities of dying were not really a problem anymore. But that became the problem. And so my responsibility was to find a language where the realities of dying were apparent and available and manifest without a lot of explanation or translation. So I made a kind of death literacy out of the language that I knew. And it turned out, as you kindly say, that it's more poetic than it is informational. And it's more nuanced and mythological than it is religious. And if I have any accomplishment in this world, maybe that's it.
That's very beautiful. So maybe that's a good entry point to talk about what that means to translate this language, this death literacy that you're talking about, into a foreign language, into Hebrew, which is an ancient, older than our culture, language. So maybe Noah, you want to say something about some of the challenges and the experiences of translating this book, Die Wise, into Hebrew. Noah.
Well, I'm not going to talk now about specific words, you know. I want to talk about two things. One is the poetic part of this book, poetic soul of this book. And the second is about the connection to Hebrew that I find. The poetic, for me, it was a kind of a help because I'm a poet writer. So for me, the fact that it was very, very poetic book helped me to understand it, because I didn't, I listened to the music or to the pictures that I was given, and not to the exact things. And the second, for now, is that I think that because the Hebrew is such an old language which renewed in this last, I don't know, 100 and some years, it contains still words that are having the meaning, the true meaning of the things. For example, to obey, a word that you use a lot, it's in the same in Hebrew. You can use it in the word to hear, which means to obey. It's the same word, the same root. So for me to find this special words that Hebrew are still have together in one word was really very interesting and very satisfying when I could find it. It's like the Hebrew is not, is very deep language, very old and very pictorial in itself. Of course, a lot of things I was struggling, but maybe I really have a question about how did you write it actually? Did you write it in one piece, or, you know, in a long time, or part by part? How did you write it?
Okay. The conditions are actually an important detail for me personally, because I was, at the time, this was 2014, I think, and I was having a lot of trouble with my lungs. And I wasn't sure that I was going to live through the wintertime, because it was quite serious. And so I imagined the worst, of course, and immediately cast sentence over myself and what's likely to happen in the next 3-4 months, no? And so then if this doesn't sound too grandiose, I imagine, okay, so the news comes out, I'm the death guy, and suddenly I'm dead too, which is very good for the career and very good for business for a little while, you can imagine. And so I would imagine a lot of inquiries coming in to this Orphan Wisdom website, you know, for more stuff, more not quite complete stuff, you know, real stuff. I mean, for example, at the time, a woman wrote to me and she said she'd had a dream in which God had appeared to her and directed her to be in touch with me. And God said to her as follows: tell him when he's dying to set up a few cameras in the room, you know, of different places, so you have a variety of shots, and then broadcast it live. So this is the kind of crazy stuff I was imagining happening, but I wouldn't be there to, you know, have this effect. And so I thought, what do I do in this circumstance to spare people on my end the terrible publicity, if you will? And I thought, okay, I'm going to write something. I don't know what it is, but I'll write something that answers all the questions I can anticipate. And that'll have to be good enough. And so I literally sat down in southern Mexico on a a rooftop, probably like what you have, you know, the flat rooftop. And I began with a pen and a little writing book. And what I did was, I didn't start with any ideas at all. I started with this concern and with writing down every story I could remember. That was all, just every story. And here's what I found, and this was alchemical, really, that as I wrote the stories down, and I wasn't interpreting them or translating them, I was transcribing them almost. The details were very important. And, you know, I told the story in my way. And as I did so, some kind of connective tissue began to grow between the stories. They began to think about each other. They began to, like children in a family do. They were thinking about the older ones and the younger ones and responding accordingly. And before you knew it, this connective tissue was another story, kind of the story of now, the story of how I happened and why these things seemed important and how did I end up in the death trade. And I realize now I wrote 2 books because I didn't think I was going to have a chance. So I wrote one book about palliative care explicitly, and then another book that tried to imagine out loud, how did all this happen this way? Because, you know, people are terribly served by the medical system that I worked in, but nobody chose it. So how do you possibly understand this terrible calamity that doesn't seem to bother anyone? And somewhere in that mystery, Die Wise was born. I didn't really realize it was a book for about maybe a week, but I worked every day like a monk in the scriptorium. I woke up at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. I sat down, I didn't speak a word, got dressed up better than today, and sat down outside and 1 glass of water and don't get up. Just write until 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And then nothing. And I did this for 3 weeks. And basically the Die Wise that you translated happened just like that with very little editing. It came to me exactly as you read it and as you translated it. And I have to say, I admire the book now, even though I did 2 for 1. And I probably shouldn't have done it, but I didn't think there was a future, you see. And when you don't think there's a future, your imagination does interesting things.
Wow, that's so interesting. So in those 2 for 1 books, one about palliative care and the other about how everything came about. So it's 20 years later now. How do you see those things now? Is there any difference? These have been very formative years. We had COVID.
Well, I have to say, and this is only true about my corner of the world. I haven't traveled enough to know elsewhere. I have to rely on people telling me when they write me letters and things. But sadly, it seems everything I talked about in Die Wise has gotten worse. I think that's fair to say. I don't know if this is true, for example, in Israel and or other places, but it's certainly true. Here's a good example. So when I wrote the book, euthanasia was illegal. It was a kind of murder in the criminal code in Canada. And here we are 7, 8 years later, it's legal. We have a national program for people who want to end their lives before they otherwise would. The people who advocated for this would imagine this to be the great leap forward, to use that Russian expression from years ago. But I observe very carefully. This is what I do. I look very carefully. I don't really anticipate the future very much. I talk about the present. It's enough. It's more than enough. And in the present, here's what I've seen. So you have a death-phobic culture that's considering euthanasia and decides it's a good idea. Do you think they do this so that the death-phobic culture can no longer be death-phobic? Well, if you favor the motion, then of course you think that's what's happening. But you have to remember, that the culture is death phobic in the first place and then legalizes euthanasia, does it continue to be death phobic subsequent to the legalization? My answer would be yes, in a slightly different way. How so? Well, they legalize euthanasia because dying is so terrible. And because dying is, by definition, it makes suffering that's not necessary. That's the conceit of the arrangement, yeah? So then you pass the legislation and now nobody has to suffer. Here's the interesting thing. They have found that for, let's say, 100 people sign up for the program on a given day, and they're approved for the program, because you have to be approved. No, make sure you're not crazy, you're not depressed, you're in a few other things. But you're dying in a death phobic culture. If you're not a little bit crazy, you're crazy. No, I think so. But anyway, so the circumstance now is that the conviction about dying is awful is still there. Dying makes suffering that doesn't have to be, is still there. Now, of the 100 people who qualified for the program, maybe 7 people use it. The rest of the people have the paper. They can do it at any time, and 92 of them never do. What does it tell you? Was it being able to do it? Was it the actual act? Clearly not. It was being able to. And as soon as you're able to, it does something to the suffering. So here's my question. Is it possible to get to the same place without the paper? The same understanding, the same peace of mind, the same sense of social responsibility without the paper, without the legislation, without the, relatively speaking, easy solution? I think the answer is yes. And I would die wise to make the claim that the answer is yes.
Yes.
But in order to do this, you have to challenge the death phobia. You see? So that's what I tried to do.
When I hear you, I find match story, you know, the story of how you write the book with your thinking maybe you're going to die, and the issue that you are talking about. So it's like, you know, a theme in a theme, a narrative in a narrative, you know. Well, I really like it. It's very poetic.
By the way, it wasn't, I thought I was going to die. We both know that I am going to.
Yeah.
I was wrong about the timing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
But death is a good instigator of book writing, right?
It can be.
It can be.
You know, it could make you just write a diary. I mean, as if anybody's interested in what's happening with you. I mean, some people would be, but it's not a good interest to have, a fascination with somebody's, you know, conversation with themselves.
Right.
The world is a big place. You can do better than write to yourself.
Right. But if you have something to say and you have limited time to say it.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe what you have to do is get what they call in English an amanuensis, someone who's listening carefully to you as you, yeah,
blah, 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 yeah.
And they do some approximation of what you said. This is how we know, for example, who Rumi is. Apparently, they say he didn't write a word.
Right.
But he had a number of people listening carefully and comparing. And for that matter, Jesus apparently never wrote a word either. And some people know what he said too.
Right. Well, you know, in Hasidic teaching, this is very common because during the Saturday, you're not allowed to write.
Right.
So whatever you were saying, somebody had to remember it and write it afterwards. So.
Right.
I want to talk about some narrative that I find in the book. Maybe we talked about it, or maybe not, but there is a story, a big narrative that is well, I don't know the word, but it's all around the book, which is a night. It starts in a night. The book starts at night.
Yes.
And it's ends in when the light is coming out.
At dawn.
At dawn, exactly. And it's very, very beautiful. And I'd really like to know did you thought about it from the beginning, or did you, when did it came to be like that? And what does it mean to you?
Yeah. No one has ever asked me about this. Isn't that amazing? Never.
Amazing.
It's right there. It's the architecture of the book. It's the vehicle of the book is one long night.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm saying a few things here. One is many things can happen in one long night. Two, you don't need light. In fact, light makes things disappear in a certain fashion. I said in the next book that I wrote, I said something like, you begin in the light, but you end in wisdom if the gods prevail, but otherwise light. So I'm not a big fan of illumination. I think the shadow is a much more important. We apprentice to our shadow, or should, much more than we should apprentice to ourselves. So how did it happen then? Well, I was very captivated with this, and I wrote it at the beginning, this understanding that you can look into the night sky, you can see the light of the stars, you can point to them, you can talk about the zodiac and so on, and it's possible that a good number of them are not there while you're talking about them, while you see them. So they're just the confoundment of that fact, because of the speed of light and so on, is I instantly saw a relationship between the presence of the dead and the presence of the light of the star. Yeah. It's too easy to say it's not there anymore, because it is there.
It's so beautiful.
But it's not there the way you want it to be. Its presence has a different quality than you have. Yeah. So this is my understanding of ancestry, is that your ancestors are, if you will, like a night sky that you can only see if you're willing to stay up and not have your sleep and not be distracted by a lot of conversation and Netflix and all that business, that you actually go out of your house and look up and use a discipline and use an inquiry to see what's not there anymore. So obviously, if I can say that way, and I see the sky, and I'm lucky to live way, way out in the country, so we have very little light pollution, and this is very possible, then you can see easily that this understanding gave itself to me. It said, here, I think you can use this for this project. And so it became the overture, like the Beethoven overture. You know, this is the first notes of the whole book. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, of course, as I'm coming to the end, and I establish us at dawn. So it's been a very long evening. And many things have become apparent, but the coming of the light, the coming of the busyness, the coming of conversation and people waking up is going to make all of this disappear. Yeah. And you're going to have to work very, very hard at trying to remember anything. Never mind, try to make it part of your life. And so one of the things the book is an act of memory. And of course, I was lucky enough to work with a lot of dying people. They're all dead now, of course. And this was a great privilege, you see. But I don't understand myself as having a kind of blood debt to these people. But I do know that because they let me in, in a really troubling time, maybe the hardest time there is, then that properly should do something to my life. Yeah. Then my life becomes wider than my own concerns. And in that sense, I took some dictation from them. They didn't know that's what was happening. I didn't know either. But you remember those stories I told you that I began with? Well, that's them. And so you could say, oh man, they're dead and they're still there. That's true. They're still there. And I did my best to be honest about them. Yeah, not artificially praising them. Of course not, because they said terrible things and they didn't do very well, many of them, and they died terribly. Most of them died terribly. And they didn't think about their families much at all, not really. That's all true. But these people were what death phobia looks like. And I had a responsibility first to be faithful to their example before I did anything to try to change it. And I think my assumption is, if I was honest enough about what I saw, the case for making change would be made just from the authenticity, not from the advocacy, just me doing this. You see, this is what happens when you're hopeful. You see, I have no reason to lie to you. This is what the woman said about her husband. He's having a bad day when he can't live another minute. But that's the way she described, and on and on. If I don't use the D word, what secret am I helping you keep? And all of these things that I could never have invented myself, but they gave them to me, you see? So then I took what they gave to me and I gave it to my little corner of the world with some minor adjustments.
As a Jewish, I was very touched by this night because of Jacob and the ladder, you know, this scene that he's going in the way and he sleeps and he sees the night full of stars and a ladder that the angels are going up and down. This is a very cultural Jewish narrative story, and I really, because of the angel of death that you talk a lot in the book, and struggling and wrestling. This is the word. So I really was very touched by it. It was like echoing a deep knowledge that we all have. A very old story, so I was really touched by it.
Well, I'm glad.
Very poetic, beautiful opening and ending of this whole book.
You know, the amazing thing about what you've just said to me is this. So I was writing very specifically about the only culture I really know. This very young, not really a culture, called Anglo-North America, yeah? And I was using that language, that syntax. I was changing it as best as I could, but still. And because I was doing so faithfully to the particulars of a place, you recognize something that doesn't come from here, that's not exclusive to here, but it's particular enough that it evokes the particulars that you know. And so the amazing thing is, for me, this is not a global story. It's not another program of globalization. This is me saying something very specific about Anglo-North America and the poverties that we have. And if I did it right, you hear something in there that gives you back some aspect of your cultural inheritance. Yeah. Now, that's just a marvel. You know, the more specific we're willing to be, the more faithful, the more available we are to other people. The more we try to be available to other people, the less specific we are, and we start talking about humanity before you know it.
Yeah.
And who's that?
That is very moving. That's very moving. I had the same thoughts when I read the book. at first I thought, maybe I'm the only one who's hearing Jacob in this. Probably not, but I felt it was talking to me specifically.
I'm glad.
Specifically that scene of wrestling with the angel.
Yeah.
And another thing that it was really helpful, because let's say it was a very, very difficult book to translate. And to be honest, it is my first book to translate. I'm not usually a translator. And this book just called me. And it just found me in a way. But what helped me really is a paragraph in the beginning of the book that you talk about music and playing around the beats, but not saying, and I'm not a musician, but I immediately understood that this is going to be like that, and not saying the actual things, but just dancing. And I also recognize this. I really enjoy it. So thank you for just writing a book without telling me what to do, you know, or telling people what to do.
Yes, I think maybe sometimes I made mistakes and I did start telling people what to do. Like in the title, for example.
Yeah.
The title is quite aggressive, no?
Think about what you should do, yes.
Yeah, the title doesn't say, if you feel like it, or if you agree, or if you have the time. It doesn't say that. No. It's very emphatic, no? But that's the tone of the time I was in, for sure. Yeah, but as far as the rhythm goes that you're describing, so you know that I have a performance show or project called Nights of Grief and Mystery. And I believe we're coming to Israel, if everything works out, in June. I think it's June.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we're going to do a couple of these shows for the first time in Israel. I'm very excited. And in there, I have to do exactly what you've described. So I have a band, you know, I have musical, it's not really accompaniment. It's, they're my accomplices, right? And somewhere in there, they establish a kind of like this, yeah? Now, I could do exactly the same thing here. Da-da, da-da. I could replay it and do it over and over. And every once in a while I do. I drop into that rhythm just long enough to say, I know it's there, but I'm going to do something else and use it instead of writing it. So I will talk about everything except that one. And if I leave it out successfully, you will hear it as if for the first time, because you're not hearing it like this. You're hearing everything else around it instead. And if I could use a parallel that I think is mythological, this is what happens when people die and we really take care of them properly, is that we begin to tell their stories, no? And then not everybody can remember the details. And before you know it, they're telling stories about other people that related to these, that were similar stories or relatives of this person. And before you know it, they're talking about everybody else, not the dead person at all. And in this way, the dead person their lives begin to mean something that could never happen while they were alive, right? Okay, that's what I try to do in the Nights of Grief and Mystery, and that's what I learned sitting at the deathbed. And that's why I told that story towards the end about people making those home movies, right? You remember that one? Mm-hmm. And how sorrowful that is that they're making these movies to show this movie, this official version of who they are, that they get to narrate, right? So they're the editor, they're the translator, they're the poet, they're the amanuensis, they're everything. Well, the problem with that, there's a few of them, but one of them is you take everybody and you push them out of the way. And you imagine what's left is you. But if you push everybody out of the way, you are the first casualty. Right. The meaning of your life is not yours you don't know what it is. You contribute to it, but you're not the boss. No, the people around you are the boss, and you have to trust them with your life towards the end. The same way that when you have children, sooner or later, you have to trust the village with your kids. And if you don't, your kids can smell that. And they smell that from you, the world is not a trustworthy place. It's not a good place. They have to be defended against the world instead of being befriended by the world. And now this becomes the meaning of your life instead of what you thought you were trying to do, you see, and on and on. So this is why in the Grief Walker film, I say to that woman towards the end of the film, something like, you are setting the table for how whether your family can be a family by how you die. And she thought this was the end of her mothering. But I said, no, this is the most compelling of you. All your mothering is now. I don't think it helped, to be honest. It didn't help them. It didn't help them. But many people have talked about that scene. Particularly, it moved them. So in some fashion, well, I couldn't help her because in some ways it was too late. The convictions were too strong, right? But I was able to be of some use to people who saw the film instead. And you never know the consequence of your little life. You're not really in charge of it, no? You just try to do your little work. And the people tell you what you mean. And you go, really? And it's a beautiful thing.
And it all gets interwoven into something that we can't expect.
Yes, it's like life. It's bigger than what you believe. It's bigger than your cultural beliefs, but your cultural beliefs are absolutely mandatory at the same time. It's amazing, no?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I feel like you need to hear it with your right brain, maybe, in order to really get something out of it. And
more than once too. That's the important thing. I mean, the good thing about writing a book is the page doesn't disappear because you turn it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is there. Yeah.
You can turn back again and say, what?
Show the book.
Yeah.
You know?
We're doing some marketing.
Yeah, marketing. So
let's continue.
Iyelet, let's talk about the visit.
Yes, marketing. Let's do that. So we're coming to Israel second time. Last time was 4 years ago.
Yes.
And we're so happy that you're coming in June for 10 days, full of retreats and 2 concerts. We're very excited about that, and many different events that will happen. What is it like for you to coming back to Israel second time? Can you say anything about that?
I think I can, yes. First of all, I never thought I'd be there once. So to be there twice is it's a mystery and a mitzvah at the same time. I don't understand it, but I'm happy to be included in it. That's one. 2, I went to divinity school, but I myself never went to church. I mean, literally never went to church. So, and I tried to get into the priesthood. No.
Wow.
It's a very strange arrangement, and needless to say, they didn't let me in. So that was very wise. And it's worked out very well for me since then. But I didn't learn theology so much. I didn't really learn religion so much. I learned the little example that some people call Jesus. That's what happened. And I learned cultural and linguistic and poetic skills by studying that material. I didn't learn a system of belief. I learned a way of coming to life, not a way of obliging other people to live. So, but I never ever in my wildest dreams did I imagine that I'd be sitting there in the place where all of this began, that I had learned, you see. Now, I have to tell you something that you may not anticipate me saying. As a North American, I've had a lot to be mournful about during the course of my life. For example, the disposition of indigenous people on this continent, which for us is very close by in history, in time, but also in geographical proximity, very close. And so you don't get to walk away, and you can pretend, but it's not a good idea. So I've seen all these things. I've seen how it began. I've seen that it could have been otherwise, and it wasn't, you see? And I was in a place in England called Plymouth Harbor. And this is the place that the first Americans left from and went to somewhere in Massachusetts, whatever it was. And of course, this place is heavily celebrated. But I was there. I had no celebration whatsoever. My heart was very heavy about it, no? And then they took me to a place in outside, where was it in Spain, Natalie? Outside what? We can't remember right now, but this was the real place that Columbus got all his water and his food before he left. Not the official place, the actual place. Outside Cadiz, I think, somewhere in there. And I stood there and I was full of sorrow. I mean, unspeakable sorrow. And I took all the money I had, all the silver I had, and a silver money clip, and I threw it into the swamp. Some kind of acknowledgement and recognition. You know what I'm going to tell you now.
Yes.
I was in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it was exactly the same. And I sat there and I watched all the people come and go, and all the women prostrate themselves in front of the stone, and all the things you know about. And I thought to myself, it could have been so different. It could have been, well, I can't even finish the sentence. It's too strong.
It's heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking.
We have so much work that it needs to be done. We, as Israelis, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we very much hope that your visit will support us. Encourage us. I don't even know how to say that, to do the work that we need to do. Mm-hmm. We have so much that we could have done otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I hear you. I don't understand all the implications of what you're saying, but I hear the sorrow, the grief of the thing. And so when the man made the movie about me, this was before I went to Israel and all that, and he called me Grief Walker, which has a very indigenous sound to it in English. Yeah. But it seems to be very accurate now more than ever. So the fact that I'm going again, I would say I'm going to Israel for the first time again.
Wow.
By which I mean, I don't think I'm repeating something. I'm an older guy. It's probably the case that I'll never come again. This is it. And to be in a place that has everything that we're acknowledging now, and to know that I'm towards the end of my time, yeah, with no drama, just with an understanding that there's some gravitas for me. And I should PS on the end of this, we have one of our countrymen here in this country who became very famous in the world. You probably know who I'm going to talk about.
Yes.
Yeah. And, to know that, that he made a place in his life for his Jewishness.
Yes.
He said about himself, he said, I never met a religion I didn't like. So, of course, he was involved in a lot of wondering. But he never said, this is no good, so I have to find something else. He just continued to be amazed at human religiosity, right? And so, I know a lot of quotations from Mr. Cohen.
Right.
But one of them that I'm thinking now, he said about himself, he said, I'm sentimental, if you know what I mean. I love this country, but I can't stand the scene. So I'm neither left nor right. I'm just staying home tonight, getting lost in this hopeless little screen. But I am stubborn like those garbage bags that time cannot decay. I'm junk, but I'm still holding up this little wild bouquet. I mean,
Amazing.
it was completely, and I get to go to the same place that he felt was an important place for him to go in his life too.
Right.
So it's a wonderful thing. And I see if I can find one place that his feet were, and I'll put my foot there too.
Absolutely.
Nice.
Thank you. This was really, really moving.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're very much looking forward to you guys coming. And we need all of this inspiration that you just gave us is very much needed for us.
Thank you. I have to tell you something that happened the last time I was there, which I never imagined happening. So I think I was in Neve Shalom. Is this the name of the place?
Neve Shalom.
Yes, I was there. And so, of course, when you're the guy, people come to you and they stay away from you at the same time. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. And I was very careful not to be too presumptuous about my own cultural information, because I'm in a different place, the other side of the world, and etc. But people would come to me when no one else was listening in the breaks in between the sessions. And they would say very strongly, they said, listen, you can't stop now, okay? Don't listen to anybody when they tell you we have it all figured out. This is what we say to each other, but it's a lie. We don't have any of this stuff figured out. We're worse at grief than anybody. So don't listen to them when they tell you this. Just keep going. So what am I supposed to do with this information, right, when I go back on the stage, right? But I never forgot the sense of urgency that these people came to me. And they said, please don't stop now. Don't pull back a little bit. Don't be too careful. If you're going to make a mistake in the direction of too strong. The worst is that you're forgiven or not.
Let me join in that plea to you. Maybe we need all the help we can get.
Well, I'm glad.
Wow.
I should also say, and I'll finish my contribution to this call with this. I suppose translation happens all the time. I myself will never get used to it. If it happens more frequently than this, I still will be amazed. But here's why. And this is not me being humble. This is me being mystified. I don't know how anybody could find my strange kind of English accessible enough if English is their second language. But then to devote months and months of their life and all that intellectual energy to making my voice legible without turning me into a Hebrew-speaking person, which I'm not. This is an amazing act of grace, which I don't know why it came to something I did, but I'm extremely lucky and very honored that it did. And for me to have the religious education that I do, but no religious history in my family, none whatsoever. And then to, the country, the place, the historical place where this little example, this Jesus example came from, to give me this honor is just, it just makes me realize perhaps I'm not completely finished, what I have to do. And I still have to be responsible to this grace and this honor. So thank you for increasing my burden and making my life even more challenging than it already was. And I'm very looking forward to going to see you and blaming you for this extra burden.
Yes. So thank you very much, Noah Bareket.
Yeah, thank you.
For all your efforts.
It was an honor and a grace to do it, and I felt I really like it. I liked it so much that I decided to be a translator, and I'm now studying to be a professional translator. Yeah.
Very good.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Noah and Stíven and Natalie behind the scenes.
And
hi.
Iyelet
She's right there.